The chains around my wrists were made of something colder than metal should ever be. I felt it pulling the warmth straight out of my skin as two guards dragged me across a floor, so polished I could see my own tired face staring back at me. My name is Daniel Foss, and 3 days ago I was a cargo pilot trying to finish one last delivery before my contract ended. Now I was being marched into a throne room built by a species that saw humans as nothing more than clever animals. The hall around me stretched taller than any cathedral I had ever seen. Pillars of dark crystal rose on either side, humming faintly, as if the whole building were alive and breathing. Rows of alien nobles lined the path, their tall, thin bodies wrapped in robes that shimmered like oil on water. None of them looked at me with curiosity. They looked at me the way you look at something you plan to step on. At the far end of the hall sat the queen. She did not look like a monster. That was the strange part. Her skin held a pale silver sheen, her eyes were a deep violet, and she sat with a stillness that made every guard in the room seem restless by comparison. But stillness is not the same as calm. I could feel something heavy pressing down from where she sat, something that had nothing to do with her crown and everything to do with grief. The guards forced me to my knees in front of her. Pain shot up through my legs, but I refused to make a sound. I had learned that much already. Whatever these people wanted from me, they were not getting the satisfaction of hearing me break. "This is the one?" the queen asked. Her voice carried through the hall without her raising it at all. A tall advisor stepped forward, robes trailing behind him like a shadow with a mind of its own. "Yes, Your Majesty. Captured near the outer trade lanes. A pilot, nothing more." "Nothing more," the queen repeated, and something in her tone made the advisor flinch. She rose from her throne, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath with her. "Bring it to me." I did not understand what she meant until 2 more guards entered from a side chamber, carrying something wrapped in dark cloth between them, like a body prepared for burial. They set it down on a stone pedestal in front of the throne and pulled the cloth away. It was a sword. Not an ordinary sword. Even from where I knelt, chained and aching, I could feel that this weapon was different. The blade was long, straight, and colored like captured starlight. Silver, but somehow deeper than silver, as if it held galaxies folded inside the metal. The hilt was wrapped in a material I did not recognize, dark as midnight, worn smooth by a grip that had once held it every single day. But it was dead. I did not know how I knew that, only that I did. The blade lay there without light, without sound, without whatever presence a weapon like that should have carried. It looked like a beautiful thing that had forgotten how to be beautiful. "My husband carried this blade for 400 years, the queen said, and for the first time her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to hear the woman underneath the crown. It was bonded to him before he could walk. It answered only to him. When he died defending our border, the blade went silent. It has not spoken, has not glowed, has not answered a single hand since, including mine." I did not know why she was telling a chained prisoner any of this. I glanced around the hall and saw the same confusion on the faces of her court. Whatever was happening here, it was not planned, it was not tradition, it was something born from desperation. "Every champion in this empire has tried to wake it," the queen continued. "Every noble, every warrior, every one of my own children. It does not respond. My advisors tell me the bond died with my husband, but I do not believe that. A bond like ours does not simply end." She looked at me now, directly, and her violet eyes held a mixture of anger and something close to pleading. "You are nothing to this empire. A trapped animal with no stake in our politics, no claim to our history, no reason to want anything from this blade. So you will hold it, and you will prove to me, once and for all, that hope is foolish." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the whole situation had become so absurd that laughing felt like the only sane response left to me. A queen was asking a human prisoner to touch a sacred alien relic just to watch it fail, just so she could finally let go of a hope she was too afraid to admit she still carried. "Take off his chains," she said. The advisor stiffened. "Your Majesty, that is unwise. A human, armed, in your presence." "Take off his chains," she repeated, and this time there was no room for argument in her voice. The guards released my wrists. I rubbed the raw skin beneath the shackles and looked up at the sword resting on its pedestal. Every instinct in my body told me this was a trap, that reaching for that blade would end with a guard's weapon buried in my chest before my fingers even touched the hilt. But refusing felt just as dangerous. In a room full of people who saw me as disposable, doing nothing was its own kind of risk. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked toward the pedestal. The nobles around the hall leaned forward, some smirking, already certain of what they would see. Nothing. A dead blade in the hands of a dying species' newest curiosity. A story they would tell at their next gathering to remind themselves why humans did not matter. I stopped in front of the sword. Up close, it was even more striking, the metal catching light that did not seem to come from any torch or crystal in the room. My hand hovered above the hilt for a moment. I do not know what I expected to feel. Maybe nothing. Maybe the cold press of dead metal, no different from any other weapon I had ever held back on Earth. I closed my hand around it. The entire hall went white. It was not an explosion, not fire, not anything violent, but a wave of light burst outward from the blade, so suddenly that guards staggered backward and nobles cried out and shielded their eyes. I felt it too, not just around me but inside me, a pulse that started in my palm and rushed up through my arm and into my chest like my own heartbeat had suddenly doubled. The blade blazed with silver light, brighter than anything else in that vast stone hall, and for a moment I swear I heard something. Not words, not yet, just a sound like a held breath being released after a very long time. I stood frozen, sword raised without meaning to raise it, light pouring off the metal and washing over my skin. Around me, the entire court had gone completely silent. Not a whisper, not a shifted foot, not even the faint hum of the crystal pillars. Every eye in that hall was locked on me, and I realized with a jolt of fear that I had just done the one thing nobody expected. I had woken something that had been sleeping for years. I looked toward the throne. The queen had risen fully to her feet, one hand pressed against her chest, as if she could barely hold herself upright. Her violet eyes were wide, glistening, fixed on the glowing blade in my hand, like she was seeing a ghost stand up and walk across the room toward her. The advisor beside her had gone pale, his mouth open with no words coming out. Somewhere behind me, I heard a noble whisper a word in a language I did not understand, but the tone needed no translation. It was disbelief. The light in the blade did not fade. If anything, it seemed to grow steadier, settling into a soft glow that pulsed gently, almost like breathing. I could feel warmth traveling up through the hilt into my hand, spreading through my arm, and underneath that warmth was something else, something I can only describe as attention. The sword was not just glowing. It was aware. It was noticing me the same way I was noticing it, and whatever it found, it seemed to like. "That is not possible," the advisor finally managed, his voice thin and shaking. "It has not responded to anyone, not to a single soul in this empire in years." The queen did not answer him. She stepped down from the raised platform where her throne sat, moving toward me with slow, careful steps, as if she were approaching something that might vanish the moment she got too close. Her eyes never left the blade. "Kaelin," she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. It was, I would later learn, her late husband's name. I stood there, holding a weapon that did not belong to me, in a hall full of people who despised everything I represented, with a queen staring at me like I had just brought her husband back from the dead. I had no idea what I had just started. I only knew, standing there with silver light washing across my face, that whatever came next was going to change everything, for me, for her, and for an empire that had just watched a chained human prisoner do what none of its greatest warriors ever could. The blade pulsed once more in my hand, warm and steady, like it was waiting to see what I would do next. I had absolutely no idea. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time. The silver light from the blade cast long shadows across the polished floor, and I stood in the middle of that light like a man caught in the wrong dream. My arm ached from holding the sword raised, but I did not dare lower it. I did not know the rules of this place. I did not know if lowering the blade would be seen as a threat or a surrender, and either one felt like it could get me killed. The queen stopped an arm's length away from me. Up close, I could see the fine lines around her eyes, the kind that spoke of centuries rather than years, and I could see that those violet eyes were wet with tears she refused to let fall. She reached out one pale hand toward the blade, not toward me, and I instinctively tightened my grip. "May I?" she asked, and there was something almost fragile in the question, coming from a woman who commanded an empire. I loosened my hand, just slightly, and let her fingers brush against the flat of the blade. The light did not change. It did not dim or brighten or shift in any way at her touch, and I watched her face fall just a little, like she had hoped for something that did not come. "It still will not answer me," she said quietly, "even now." The advisor beside the throne finally found his voice again, though it came out sharper this time, edged with something I recognized as fear, disguised as anger. "Your Majesty, this is deeply irregular." The bonded blade of the prince consort, responding to a human, while remaining silent to you, to your children, to every noble house in this court. There must be some trick, some manipulation. "Do you believe I would allow a trick in my own throne room, General Draven?" The queen asked, and though her voice stayed calm, the temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. General Draven, I now understood was his name, straightened his robes and said nothing more, though I could feel his eyes on me like a blade of their own. He was tall even among his own people, with a scar running down one side of his face that suggested he had earned his rank through more than just politics. I filed that information away. In my short time as a prisoner, I had already learned that the people who stayed quiet after being challenged were usually the ones worth watching most carefully. The queen turned back to me. "What is your name?" "Daniel," I said. My throat felt dry, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. "Daniel Foss." "Daniel Foss," she repeated slowly, testing the sound of it. "Do you feel anything, holding that blade?" I thought about lying. Some instinct told me that whatever I felt was valuable information, and valuable information in a room full of strangers who could have me killed on a whim seemed like something to hold close. But another instinct, stronger and stranger, told me that lying to this woman right now would be a mistake I could not undo. "I feel warmth," I said honestly, "like it's paying attention, like it's listening." A murmur rippled through the gathered nobles, quickly silenced by a sharp look from the queen. She studied my face for a long moment, and I got the distinct impression she was trying to decide whether I was telling the truth or performing a very convincing lie. "Bring him to my private chambers," she said finally, turning to her guards. "Under guard, but with respect. He is not to be harmed." The word respect hung strangely in that hall, aimed at a species these people clearly saw as beneath them. I saw more than one noble exchange a glance of disbelief, and General Draven's jaw tightened in a way that told me this order had made him at least one enemy tonight, possibly more. I did not resist as the guards escorted me from the throne room, the sword still glowing faintly in my hand, refused by everyone but me. I noticed the queen watching until the doors closed between us, her expression unreadable, though I thought I saw something like hope flickering behind the grief in her eyes. The private chamber they brought me to was smaller than the throne room, but still larger than any room I had ever lived in back home. Tall windows looked out over a city I did not recognize, towers of pale stone stretching toward a sky streaked with two moons instead of one. The guards positioned themselves at the door, close enough to stop me if I tried anything, far enough to give the illusion of privacy. I sat down on the edge of a wide stone bench and finally allowed myself to lower the blade, resting it across my knees. The moment I relaxed my grip even slightly, I felt something shift inside my mind. Not a sound exactly, more like a pressure, a presence pushing gently at the edges of my thoughts. I nearly dropped the sword in surprise. "Careful," something said, though it was not really a voice, not the way I understood voices. It was more like a feeling that carried meaning, the way you might understand a friend's mood from a single glance without them saying a word. "You are not used to this." I stared down at the blade resting across my legs, my heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. "You can talk," I said out loud, feeling foolish the moment the words left my mouth, sitting alone in a room talking to a sword. "I have always been able to talk," the presence answered, and I caught something like amusement in the thought, dry and a little tired. "Very few have ever been able to listen." I swallowed hard, glancing toward the guards at the door, but they showed no reaction, no sign that they had heard anything at all. Whatever this was, it seemed to exist only between the blade and me. "Who are you?" I asked, quieter this time. "I do not have a name the way you understand names," the presence replied. "I was forged before names mattered to me. But the one who carried me longest called me Vareth. You may use that, if it helps you feel less like you are talking to yourself." Vareth. I let the name settle in my mind, strange and unfamiliar, but somehow it made this entire impossible situation feel slightly more real. I was sitting in an alien palace, holding a talking sword named Vareth, having just woken it from a sleep that had lasted since the death of a prince I had never met. "Why me?" I asked. It was the question that had been burning in my chest since the moment the light first exploded across that throne room. Everyone in that hall tried. Guards, nobles, the queen herself. Why would you wake up for a prisoner instead of any of them? There was a pause, long enough that I began to wonder if the connection had simply ended, if Vareth had decided I did not deserve an answer. But then the presence returned, heavier this time, carrying something that felt almost like sorrow. "Because none of them carried what he carried," Vareth said. And I did not expect to find it in a species I had never even considered. "What did he carry?" I pressed. "The prince, Kalen." A memory, or something like a memory, brushed against the edge of my mind, faint and distant, like trying to recall a dream after waking. I saw fragments, impossible to hold on to fully, a battlefield stretching endlessly beneath a burning sky, a figure standing alone against overwhelming odds, refusing to fall even as everything around him collapsed. A will that would not bend, would not break, would not surrender, no matter how impossible the fight became. "He did not fight because he believed he would win," Vareth said, the presence growing quieter, more intimate, as if sharing something it had not spoken of in a very long time. "He fought because giving up was never an option his heart understood." I bonded to that. Not to his blood, not to his title, not to his crown. To that single unbending piece of him that refused every excuse to stop. I sat in silence, absorbing that, feeling the weight of it settle over me like a second set of chains, lighter than the ones the guards had removed, but chains nonetheless. "And you think I have that?" I said slowly. It was not quite a question. "I did not think anything," Vareth answered. "I felt it, the moment your hand closed around my hilt. Something in you that refuses to break, even now, sitting in a palace built by people who see you as less than nothing. You are afraid, Daniel Foss. I can feel that clearly, but you have not once considered surrender as an option. That is rare, rarer than you know. I thought about my life before this, about every hard delivery run through dangerous space, every time my ship had nearly failed me, every time I had been told by someone with more power that I should simply accept my place and stop pushing for more. I had never been particularly brave. I had just never known how to stop trying. Before I could respond, the door to my chamber opened without warning, and the queen entered alone, waving off the guards who moved to follow her. She closed the door behind her and stood there for a moment, studying me with an expression I could not quite place. "It is speaking to you," she said. It was not a question either. "I can see it in your face." I hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something about her tired eyes made me decide honesty was still the safer path. "Its name is Vareth," I said. "It says it bonded to something in your husband. Something about refusing to surrender, no matter the odds." The Queen's breath caught, and for a moment the powerful ruler I had seen in the throne room disappeared entirely, replaced by a woman who missed her husband so deeply it had carved itself into every line of her face. She crossed the room slowly and sat down on a bench across from me, closer than I expected, close enough that I could see the grief was not performance. It was real, and it had been sitting inside her for a very long time. "He was like that," she said softly. "Always. Even when we were young, before either of us understood what it would cost him, he never learned how to stop fighting, even when fighting made no sense." She looked at the blade resting in my lap, and something like longing crossed her features. "I used to beg him to rest. He never listened." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it, even though I had never met the man, even though understanding him only through fragments of memory carried in a sentient sword felt like an incredibly strange way to grieve someone alongside a stranger. "Do not be sorry," the Queen said, straightening, some of her composure returning. "Be careful instead. What happened tonight in that hall was not simply a miracle to my court. It was a threat. There are those among my nobles who will not accept that a human carries what generations of my own bloodline could not earn. General Draven in particular has ambitions that my husband's death only sharpened." She met my eyes directly, and I saw something fierce burning beneath the grief now, something protective. "You woke a blade that has been silent for years, Daniel Foss. You should understand that not everyone in this palace will be pleased to see it glowing again, especially not in a human's hand." I looked down at Vareth, still resting quietly across my knees, its light dimmed now to a soft, steady glow, almost like it was listening to every word being spoken and choosing, for the moment, to stay silent. "You should listen to her," Vareth said inside my mind, and this time there was no amusement in the thought at all, only a warning, sharp and clear. "What is coming will test you far more than a single throne room ever could." I did not know yet how right that warning would turn out to be. The days that followed felt like walking through a palace built entirely of glass floors, where every step might be the one that finally shattered beneath me. I was not thrown back into a cell, which surprised me, but I was not exactly free either. Guards followed me at a distance whenever I moved through the halls the Queen permitted me to walk, and Vareth stayed at my side always, sometimes strapped to my back, sometimes simply resting nearby, its presence in my mind becoming less startling and more familiar with every passing hour. I learned quickly that the palace was not one unified place, but a web of competing interests wearing the same silver and violet colors. There were nobles loyal to the Queen out of genuine respect, others loyal out of fear, and still others who smiled politely while clearly counting the days until an opportunity to remove her presented itself. General Draven fell into that last category, though he was careful never to say anything openly treasonous where the Queen might hear. It was on the third day that I met Ellen Marsh. I found her in a small courtyard tucked behind the eastern wing of the palace, a garden filled with plants that glowed faintly in shades of blue and violet instead of green. She sat on a stone bench, a woman with tired eyes and sun-browned skin, wearing clothing patched together from mismatched fabric that told me she had been a prisoner far longer than I had. "You're the one," she said when she saw me approach. Not a question, just a statement, delivered with equal parts curiosity and suspicion. "The one who woke the ghost sword." "Vareth," I corrected gently, sitting down on the far end of the bench, keeping a respectful distance. "It has a name." "Of course it does," Ellen said, a tired smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Everything in this place has a name and a purpose, and about 6 layers of political meaning underneath both. She studied me for a long moment. I've been here almost 2 years, captured off a supply freighter near the border. Word travels fast in the servant quarters. Everyone's talking about the human who made the dead sword sing. I explained, as briefly as I could, what had happened in the throne room, and Ellen listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally like she was filing the information away for later use. When I finished, she let out a long breath and shook her head slowly. "You've made yourself a target," she said. "You understand that, right? A human, holding the most sacred relic in this empire, refusing to answer to anyone with royal blood. There are people in this palace who would have executed their own children for less of an insult. The Queen protected me," I said, though even as I said it, I heard how thin that protection might turn out to be against an empire built on tradition and bloodlines. "For now," Ellen agreed, "but queens do not rule forever, Daniel, and grief makes even the strongest of them vulnerable. If I were you, I would learn everything I could about that sword, and quickly, because the moment it becomes more useful to remove you than to keep you, someone in this palace will act." I thought about her words for the rest of that day, turning them over in my mind while Vareth remained quiet, listening, as it always seemed to be listening, though it offered no comment on Ellen's warning. That night, alone in my chamber, I finally asked the question that had been building inside me since our first conversation. "Show me," I said, resting my hand against the flat of the blade. "Show me what you remember of him, of Kalen." "I do not know if this is wise," Vareth answered, hesitation coloring the thought in a way I had not felt from it before. "Memories carried this deeply are not simple things to share. They can overwhelm. I need to understand," I said. "If I'm going to survive whatever is coming, I need to understand what it is I'm actually holding." There was a long pause, and then the room around me seemed to fade, replaced not by darkness, but by another place entirely, a battlefield stretching under a sky the color of dried blood, ash falling like snow across broken ground. I stood there not as myself, but somehow through the eyes of another, watching a war unfold that had happened long before I was born on a world I had never heard of. I saw him then, Kalen, tall, silver-skinned like the Queen, but with none of the careful stillness I had seen in her. He moved like a storm given shape, blade flashing, holding a line against enemies that outnumbered his forces 10-1. I felt the exhaustion in his limbs as clearly as if it were my own, felt the ache of wounds that should have ended the fight hours earlier, and yet he did not stop. He did not consider stopping. Every strike he made carried the same simple refusal, over and over, a heartbeat repeated until it became a kind of prayer. Not yet, not yet, not yet. I watched him rally soldiers who had already given up hope, watched him drag wounded allies from the front lines even as his own strength failed him, watched him stand between his people and an enemy commander twice his size, blade raised, refusing to yield a single step of ground even when logic and survival both screamed at him to retreat. "He was not the strongest warrior in that battle," Vareth said, its voice threading through the vision like a narrator standing just outside the memory. "He was not the most skilled, nor the most gifted, but he was the last one standing when the sun rose, because he simply refused every reason the universe gave him to fall." The vision shifted, and suddenly I was standing in a quieter place, a room lit by soft golden light, Kalen much older now, sitting beside a younger version of the Queen, both of them laughing over something I could not hear. The warmth of that memory hit differently than the battlefield, softer, more painful somehow, because I could feel how much love lived inside it, and I understood that I was watching something Vareth had chosen to protect long after the man who created it had gone. "He believed hope was a discipline," Vareth continued, the presence growing quieter, more reflective, not a feeling that arrives on its own, but a choice made again and again, especially when circumstances give you every reason to abandon it. He taught that to his people. Some listened. Most did not. It is a difficult lesson to hold on to in an empire built on strength and bloodline rather than will. The vision faded, and I found myself back in my chamber, breathing hard, my hand still resting against the blade, tears I had not noticed falling, now cooling against my cheeks. "He sounds like he was a good man," I said quietly. "He was a stubborn man," Vareth corrected, though I caught the same dry amusement from before threading through the thought, which, in my experience, is often mistaken for goodness, though the two are not always the same thing. But yes, he was good, in the ways that mattered most. I sat with that for a long moment, before another thought occurred to me, one that had been building since Ellen's warning in the garden. "You said you sensed something in me. That same refusal to break. But I'm not a warrior, Vareth. I'm a pilot. I've never held a real weapon in my life before today." "Strength was never the requirement," Vareth said. "Kalen was strong because he trained for centuries, yes, but the bond was never about strength. It was about a decision, made in the deepest part of a person, to keep going when every reasonable voice says stop. Humans, from what little I have gathered of your history through your own mind, seem to carry that decision more often than most species I have encountered. Perhaps it comes from how briefly you live. You cannot afford to waste time deciding whether hope is worth the effort." I let out a short, surprised laugh at that, the first genuine laugh I had allowed myself since arriving in this palace. That might be the most backhanded compliment I've ever received from a magic sword. "I am not magic," Vareth said, sounding almost offended. "I am simply very old, and very tired of being misunderstood." That small moment of humor did not last long. 3 days later, everything changed again. I was walking back from the eastern courtyard, having grown fond of Ellen's company during the quiet hours when guards allowed us to speak freely, when I felt Vareth's presence sharpen suddenly inside my mind, urgent and alert. "Danger," it said, no warmth left in the thought at all now, only a blade's cold focus. "Behind you. 3, moving fast." I turned just in time to see 2 robed figures rushing toward me from a side corridor, blades drawn, moving with a speed and precision that told me immediately these were not simple thieves or opportunists. A third figure hung back near the corridor entrance, watching, directing, and even at a distance I recognized the scar running down the side of his face. General Draven. I did not have time to process the shock of seeing him orchestrate an attack in broad daylight, in his own palace, because the first attacker was already closing the distance between us. I drew Vareth without fully deciding to, my body moving on instinct I did not know I possessed, and the moment the blade cleared its sheath, light flared along the metal, sharp and blinding white. "Trust me," Vareth said, and something in its voice steadied my racing heart, just enough to keep my hands from shaking. "Move as I guide you. Do not think. Simply follow." The first attacker's blade came down in a wide arc aimed at my shoulder, and my body shifted sideways before my conscious mind even registered the movement, Vareth rising to deflect the strike with a clang of metal that echoed down the corridor. I felt the impact travel up my arm, but the blade held steady, and before the attacker could recover, I found myself already moving into a counter I did not know how to perform, guided by something ancient and patient running through the hilt beneath my fingers. The second attacker joined the fight, forcing me backward, and for a few terrifying seconds I felt completely outmatched, my untrained limbs struggling to keep pace with 2 skilled fighters who had clearly trained for this exact kind of combat their entire lives. Sweat stung my eyes. My arms burned with effort I had never asked them to produce before. "You are not going to win this through skill," Vareth said, its voice cutting through my panic like a blade through fog. "You are going to win this by refusing to stop moving. That is the only thing you have ever needed." I do not know how long the fight lasted. Time seemed to compress into a series of desperate exchanges, blocked strikes, near misses, the taste of copper in my mouth from a cut lip I did not remember receiving. But somewhere in the chaos, I stopped trying to fight like a trained warrior and simply refused to fall, exactly as Vareth had shown me in that battlefield memory, refusing again and again until the refusal became its own kind of strength. The first attacker made a mistake, overextending on a strike meant to end the fight, and Vareth guided my hand into the opening before I even saw it fully, disarming him with a motion too fast for me to fully understand, even as my own arms performed it. The second attacker hesitated for just a moment, seeing his companion stumble, and that hesitation was enough. I drove forward, not with elegance, not with skill, but with the same stubborn refusal that had carried a dying prince across an ash-covered battlefield centuries ago, and the fight ended with both attackers on the ground, disarmed, breathing hard, staring up at me with something I had not expected to see in their eyes. Fear. I turned toward the corridor entrance, chest heaving, blade still glowing in my hand, but General Draven was already gone, slipped away the moment the tide had turned, leaving no proof behind except 2 failed assassins and my own racing heart as witness to what had just happened. Guards arrived moments later, alerted by the noise, and I stood there in the corridor, blood on my lip, hands shaking now that the danger had passed, staring down at the sword that had just saved my life for the second time in less than a week. "You did well," Vareth said quietly, and I could hear something almost like pride in the thought. "But this was only a warning shot, Daniel Foss. What comes next will not be so easily survived." I looked down the empty corridor where Draven had vanished, and I understood, with a cold certainty settling into my bones, that Ellen had been right. I had become a target the moment I closed my hand around this blade, and the palace that had briefly felt like a strange kind of shelter now felt like exactly what it was: a battlefield, waiting for the next fight to begin. The Queen summoned me to her private study within the hour, and I arrived still shaken, my torn sleeve hastily bound around a shallow cut on my forearm that the palace healers had wanted to treat, but I had waved away, too rattled to sit still for anything. She stood by a tall window overlooking the city, her back to me when I entered, hands clasped tightly behind her. "2 of my own household guard," she said, without turning around, "trained since childhood, loyal, or so I believed, to this throne. Both claim they acted alone, out of some misguided sense of protecting tradition. Both are lying to protect someone with far more power than either of them possesses." "Draven," I said, and she finally turned to face me, her violet eyes hard now, all traces of the grieving widow I had seen in my chamber, replaced by something colder, sharper, the version of her that had ruled an empire for centuries. "I cannot move against a general of his standing without proof," she said. "Whispers and suspicion are not enough, not against a man with as many allies among the noble houses as he has cultivated over the years. If I accuse him without certainty, I risk fracturing this court entirely, and there are enemies beyond our borders who would delight in seeing us divided." "So what happens to me?" I asked, and I heard the exhaustion bleeding into my own voice now, the accumulated weight of days spent walking through a palace that wanted me dead in at least a dozen different ways I had not even discovered yet. The Queen studied me for a long moment before answering. "There is a tradition in this empire, older than my own reign, older than my husband's reign before mine. When the legitimacy of a bond is questioned, when a relic chooses a bearer that tradition does not recognize, the bearer may be challenged to trial by combat. If they win, against a champion of the court's choosing, the bond is recognized as true, beyond question, beyond further challenge. And if I lose?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer from the grim set of her jaw. "Then you die, and the sword returns to silence, and no one troubles themselves with the matter again," she said quietly. "I am telling you this not because I wish to see you fight, Daniel Foss, but because I believe Draven intends to force this trial regardless of what either of us wants. He has already tried to remove you quietly, When that failed, he will move to remove you publicly, in a way that appears legitimate under our laws, so that even I cannot object without seeming to defy tradition itself. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of an empire's politics settling onto shoulders that had, less than 2 weeks ago, only worried about cargo manifests and fuel calculations. Then I suppose I need to prepare for a fight I don't know how to win. You survived 2 trained assassins with no formal combat experience, the Queen said, something almost gentle entering her voice again. That is not nothing. I had help, I said, glancing down at Vareth resting against my hip. I gave guidance, Vareth said, the words meant for me alone, though something in its tone suggested it wanted the Queen to hear the sentiment, even if not the words themselves. The will to keep fighting was entirely his own. I cannot manufacture that in someone who does not already carry it. The days that followed blurred into a routine unlike anything I had known before. Ellen, it turned out, had once trained in close combat before her capture, some past life she rarely spoke of in detail, and she took it upon herself to drill me in whatever spare hours we could steal from the guards' watchful eyes. My body ached constantly, bruises layering over bruises, but slowly, painfully, something like real skill began to take shape beneath the guidance Vareth offered through our bond. It is not about learning to fight like Kaelin did, Vareth told me one evening, as I sat exhausted on the floor of my chamber, muscles screaming after another brutal session with Ellen. He had centuries to build his skill. You do not have that luxury. You must learn to fight like yourself, using what you already carry, and let me fill in what experience cannot yet provide. And what do I already carry? I asked, only half joking, too tired for real humor. Stubbornness, Vareth answered immediately, without hesitation. An unwillingness to accept the ending others have already written for you. It is not elegant, but it has kept you alive twice now, and I suspect it will keep proving useful before this is finished. Word of the coming trial spread through the palace faster than I expected, and the atmosphere around me shifted noticeably. Some servants and lesser nobles began offering small kindnesses, quiet nods in hallways, an extra portion of food left near my chamber door, gestures too small to draw attention but clear enough for me to understand. Not everyone in this empire agreed with Draven's vision of tradition. Some, quietly, secretly, were beginning to hope I might actually win. Others made their disapproval just as clear. I caught more than one noble watching me with open contempt as I crossed the palace grounds, and twice I noticed servants who I later learned answered directly to Draven's household, watching me with an intensity that made the hair on my neck rise. 3 days before the trial was set to begin, Ellen found me in the eastern courtyard, her expression tighter than I had seen it before, worry etched into every line of her face. "They've announced the champion," she said without preamble. "Who?" I asked, though something in her expression already told me I would not like the answer. "Draven himself," she said. "He's petitioned to fight you personally, citing his rank and his personal stake in preserving what he calls the sanctity of the royal bloodline. The court has approved it. Apparently a general is well within his rights to claim the challenge for himself if he believes the matter concerns him directly." I felt something cold settle into my stomach. I had assumed the champion would be some anonymous warrior, skilled but distant from the politics driving this entire situation. Facing Draven himself meant facing not just a trained fighter, but a man with centuries of combat experience, deep personal motivation, and everything to gain from watching me die in front of the entire court. "He is skilled," Vareth confirmed quietly in my mind, no attempt made to soften the truth. "I have watched him train from a distance, over the years, before Kaelin's death. He fights with patience and precision. He will not make the same mistakes the assassins made in that corridor." "Then I need to be better prepared than I am now," I said, more to myself than to Ellen or Vareth, though both seemed to hear the determination in the words regardless. Ellen studied me for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her tired eyes. "You could still refuse the trial," she said quietly. renounce the bond publicly, give up the sword, apologize for the confusion, and beg the queen to send you back to whatever prison cell you came from instead. It would not be the ending anyone hoped for, but you would live. I looked down at Vareth, feeling the faint warmth still pulsing gently through the hilt, feeling the memory of that ash-covered battlefield still lingering somewhere in the back of my mind, a stubborn prince refusing every reasonable excuse to stop fighting. "No," I said, and I felt the certainty of it settle into my bones as I spoke the word aloud. "I'm not giving this up. Not to a man who tried to have me murdered in a hallway because he couldn't stand watching something he never earned, choose someone he thought didn't deserve it." Something shifted in Vareth's presence then, a warmth spreading through the connection that felt distinctly like approval, or perhaps something closer to pride. "That," Vareth said quietly, "is exactly the choice he would have made." Ellen let out a long breath, and though worry still lined her face, something like respect had joined it now. "Then we'd better make sure the training actually works," she said, pulling herself back into the practical determination that had gotten her through 2 years of captivity in this palace. "Because Draven does not intend to simply defeat you, Daniel. Men like him do not settle for winning quietly. He intends to make an example, publicly, of what happens to anyone who challenges the order he believes in." The night before the trial, I could not sleep. I sat by the tall window of my chamber, watching the twin moons rise over a city that had, against every expectation I carried when I first arrived in chains, become something closer to a strange and dangerous home. Vareth rested across my knees, quiet, present, patient in the way only something that had waited years for a single moment of connection could be patient. "Tell me honestly," I said into the darkness. "Do you think I can beat him?" "Honesty is the only thing I offer," Vareth answered. "I do not know. He is stronger than you, more experienced, more skilled, in every technical measure that combat can be judged by." I felt my stomach tighten at the blunt admission, but Vareth continued before the fear could fully take root. But strength and skill were never what determined the outcome of the battles that mattered most to Kaelin. What matters is what happens in the moment, when everything in you screams to stop, to surrender, to accept the ending someone else has already decided for you. Draven has never faced that moment. Not truly. Not the way you have faced it twice already in the past 2 weeks. He has always had power to fall back on. You have never had that luxury, and it has made you something he does not understand and cannot predict. I sat with that thought as the moons climbed higher, silver light spilling across the floor of my chamber, and for the first time since this entire impossible journey began, I felt something steady itself inside my chest. Not confidence exactly, not the absence of fear, but something quieter and more durable than either. Resolve. Tomorrow I would stand in front of an entire empire and fight for something I had never asked to carry, against a man who wanted nothing more than to watch me fail. I did not know if I would win, but I knew, with the same certainty Vareth had described watching in a dying prince centuries ago, that I would not simply lie down and let this ending be written for me. Whatever happened tomorrow, I would meet it standing. The trial grounds sat at the heart of the palace, an open arena ringed by tiered stone seating that had, according to Ellen, hosted every major dispute of honor in this empire for over 1,000 years. By the time the guards led me out into the open air, every seat was filled, silver and violet robes packed shoulder to shoulder, thousands of eyes fixed on the small circle of sand at the center where my fate would be decided. The morning air felt sharp against my skin, cool enough to raise goosebumps along my arms, though I suspected at least some of the chill running through me had nothing to do with the weather. Vareth rested in my hand, its light steady and calm, a small point of warmth in a sea of cold, watching faces. The queen sat in a raised box overlooking the arena, dressed in formal robes I had not seen before, deep violet, trimmed with silver thread that caught the morning light. Her expression gave nothing away, carefully composed into the same regal stillness I had first seen the night we met, though I thought I caught something flickering beneath the surface when her eyes found mine across the arena. Worry, carefully hidden, perhaps something more. General Draven entered from the opposite side of the arena, and the crowd's reaction told me everything I needed to know about how this trial was truly seen by most of this empire. Cheers rose from significant portions of the seating, banners bearing his household colors waved by supporters who had clearly come prepared to celebrate a victory they considered already decided. He walked with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted the outcome of a fight in his entire long life, his blade already drawn, its edge catching sunlight in a way that looked almost casual, almost bored. "People of this court," an official announced, voice amplified somehow to carry across the entire arena, "we gather today to witness the trial of bonded legitimacy, as tradition demands, between General Draven, champion of the noble houses, and Daniel Foss, bearer of the blade Vareth, by right of awakening. The victor's claim shall stand unquestioned, the defeated shall yield all further contest." I felt the weight of thousands of eyes pressing against me as the official's words settled over the arena, and for a moment, standing there in the center of that vast open space, I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Then I felt Vareth's presence steady in my mind, patient and unshaken, and I remembered the memory it had shown me, a prince standing alone against odds far worse than these, refusing every reasonable excuse to fall. "You are not alone in this," Vareth said quietly, "meant only for me. Whatever happens, remember that." Draven crossed the arena floor slowly, each step deliberate, and stopped a respectful distance away, close enough that I could see the scar along his face more clearly now, the pale line running from temple to jaw like a permanent reminder of some old battle. His eyes held none of the desperate cruelty I might have expected from a man who had already tried to have me murdered in a hallway. Instead, they held something almost like sadness, buried beneath layers of certainty. "I hold nothing against you personally," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it over the roar of the crowd, settling into anticipation. "You are simply a symptom of a mistake this empire has allowed to fester for far too long. That blade belongs to bloodline and tradition, not to chance, not to accident. After today, this court will remember why those traditions exist." "I never asked for this blade," I said, meeting his eyes steadily despite the tremor I could feel building in my chest. "But I'm not giving it up because a man who tried to murder me in a hallway thinks tradition matters more than truth." Something flickered across Draven's expression, brief and sharp, gone before I could fully read it. Then he stepped back, raised his blade in formal salute toward the Queen's box, and the arena fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The official's voice rang out again, a single word that seemed to hang suspended in the cold morning air. "Begin." Draven moved first, and he moved fast, faster than I had expected from a man of his apparent age, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat, with a strike aimed low at my legs, testing, probing for weakness. I brought Vareth down to block on instinct, feeling the impact travel up through my arm, and immediately understood that Ellen's warning had not been an exaggeration. This was nothing like the desperate scramble against the two assassins in that corridor. This was a master testing an opponent he had already decided was beneath serious concern. He pressed forward with a series of strikes, each one probing a different angle, and I found myself giving ground steadily, blocking what I could, dodging what I could not, feeling the crowd's energy shift as murmurs began rippling through the tiered seating. I could hear, even over the clash of metal, snatches of commentary, some disappointed, some satisfied, as if the outcome of this fight had already been written in their minds before the first real exchange had even finished. "Do not fight his rhythm," Vareth said sharply in my mind, cutting through the rising panic threatening to cloud my thinking. "He wants you reactive, always one step behind, always defending. Break the pattern. Force him to react to you instead." I did not know how to force a master swordsman to do anything, but I trusted the guidance running through the bond between us, and on Draven's next strike, instead of simply blocking, I twisted the parry into a counter, driving forward instead of retreating. It caught him slightly off guard, his eyes widening just a fraction before he recovered, stepping back to reassess. The crowd's murmur shifted, just slightly, surprise threading through the noise now. We continued like that, exchange after exchange, my arms burning with effort, sweat stinging my eyes despite the cool morning air, every muscle in my body screaming for the fight to end. Draven was relentless, methodical, each strike calculated to wear me down rather than end things quickly, and I understood with growing dread that he intended to let exhaustion do what skill alone might not accomplish quickly enough to satisfy him. "He is trying to outlast you," Vareth confirmed, echoing my own fear back at me with unsettling clarity. "He believes your will has limits his does not." "Does it?" I gasped between exchanges, barely able to spare the breath for the question. "I do not believe so," Vareth answered. "But belief alone will not be enough. You must prove it, to him, to this court, and perhaps most importantly, to yourself." The fight stretched on, minutes bleeding together into a blur of clashing metal and burning muscles, and slowly, I began to feel my body reaching limits I had never tested before. My arms trembled with every block, my legs felt heavy, unsteady beneath me. Draven, by contrast, seemed barely winded, his centuries of training carrying him through the fight with an ease that felt almost cruel in contrast to my own struggling exhaustion. He pressed his advantage, driving me backward toward the edge of the arena circle, and I stumbled, catching myself just before crossing the boundary that would have ended the trial in his favor. The crowd roared at the near miss, and I saw, in the fraction of a second I allowed myself to glance toward the Queen's box, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Draven pressed forward for what I sensed was meant to be a finishing sequence, his blade moving in a pattern too fast and too precise for my exhausted body to fully track. I felt the first strike graze my shoulder, a line of fire opening across my skin, and the second strike sent Vareth spinning briefly in my weakened grip before I managed to reclaim control. I fell to one knee in the sand, breathing hard, blood soaking into my torn sleeve, and for a single terrible moment, every reasonable part of my mind screamed that this was where it ended. I had fought as hard as I could. I had lasted longer than anyone, including myself, might have expected. Surely no one would blame me for finally allowing exhaustion and inevitability to have their way. Draven stood over me, blade raised for what both of us understood would be the final blow, and something in his eyes, that same buried sadness I had noticed before the fight began, seemed almost apologetic. "You fought well," he said quietly, "meant only for me. Better than any human I have ever encountered. But this ends here." I looked past him, toward the Queen's box, toward her wide violet eyes, and the grief and hope tangled together across her face, and I thought of Kalen, a man I had never met, standing alone, on an ash-covered battlefield, against odds far worse than these, refusing every reasonable excuse the universe offered him to fall. Not yet, I thought, and felt the words echo through the bond, through Vareth, through whatever remained of that ancient stubborn will still living inside the blade. Not yet. The light in Vareth flared, brighter than I had ever felt it, warmth flooding up through my arm and into my exhausted chest, like a second wind drawn from somewhere far beyond my own limited strength. I do not know if it was the blade lending me something extra in that final moment, or simply my own will finally catching up to the desperate need to survive, but I found myself moving before Draven's blade could complete its downward arc, rolling aside, coming up onto my feet, on legs that should not have still been capable of holding me. Draven's strike met empty sand where I had knelt a moment before, and the momentum of his swing left him exposed for just a fraction of a second, an opening I would never have recognized without the guidance still humming through the bond between Vareth and me. I did not think. I simply moved, driving forward with everything my exhausted body had left, and Vareth met Draven's recovering blade with a strike that rang out across the arena like a bell, sending his weapon spinning from his grip to land in the sand several feet away. The arena fell utterly silent. Draven stood there, unarmed, staring at me with an expression I could not fully read, something between disbelief and, strangely, a kind of relief. I stood opposite him, Vareth's tip resting near his throat, my own chest heaving with exhaustion, blood and sweat mixing on my skin, and for a long moment neither of us moved, the entire arena holding its breath alongside us. "Finish it," Draven said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearest the arena floor to hear. "You have won the right." I looked down at the blade in my trembling hand, feeling Vareth's presence steady and calm, despite everything we had just survived together, and I understood, with a clarity that settled deep into my bones, that this was not the ending Kaelin would have chosen, not the ending that stubborn refusal to break had ever truly been fighting for. I lowered the blade. "I don't need to kill you to prove this bond is real," I said, loud enough now for the entire silent arena to hear. "I already have." A murmur swept through the crowd, disbelief and something like awe tangled together in the sound. I turned toward the Queen's box, and I saw her rise slowly from her seat, one hand pressed against her chest, tears finally falling freely down her face, without any attempt to hide them. She descended from the box and crossed the arena floor herself, ignoring the protocol that surely demanded some formal procedure for concluding a trial like this, and stopped in front of me, studying my face with an intensity that made me feel, for the first time since arriving in this empire, truly seen. "He would have done exactly this," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, sparing an opponent who had already yielded, even one who tried to end his life the day before. I had almost forgotten that particular stubbornness of his, until I watched you carry it just now. "I'm not him," I said honestly, exhaustion and relief making the words come easier than they might have otherwise. "I never will be." "No," she agreed, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the composed mask she had worn since the moment I met her. "You are something else entirely. Something this empire has never truly understood, until today." She turned toward the silent arena, raising her voice so it carried across every tiered seat, every silver and violet robe watching with rapt attention. "Let it be known, by trial witnessed and blade unquestioned, that the bond between Vareth and Daniel Foss stands beyond further challenge. Let it also be known that mercy, shown even to an enemy who deserved none, is not weakness. It is the very quality my husband carried throughout his life, and the very quality this blade sought when it chose to wake again after years of silence." The crowd's reaction shifted slowly from stunned silence into something else entirely, scattered applause building gradually into a wave that swept across the arena, uncertain at first, then steadier, until even some of Draven's own supporters found themselves swept up in the strange, unexpected triumph of what they had just witnessed. Draven himself knelt in the sand, retrieving his fallen blade, and rather than the resentment I might have expected, I saw something like genuine respect settle over his scarred features as he rose and offered a formal bow, deeper than protocol required. "I was wrong," he said simply, quietly, meant for me alone, even as the crowd's noise swelled around us. "About what your species could carry. I do not think I will make that mistake again." I nodded, too exhausted for anything more elaborate, and felt Vareth's presence pulse warmly in my hand, something that felt distinctly like satisfaction, threading through the connection. "You did well," Vareth said, echoing the words it had offered after that first desperate fight in the corridor, though this time the pride behind them felt deeper, more settled. Kaelin would have been glad to see his blade choose someone who understood what he always tried to teach. That strength is never truly measured by how hard you can strike, but by how long you are willing to keep standing. In the weeks that followed, everything about my life within that palace changed. The queen granted me a formal place within her court, not as a prisoner, not as a curiosity, but as something closer to family, an honor few outsiders had ever received in the long history of that empire. Ellen, too, found her freedom restored, her skill and loyalty finally recognized rather than simply endured. Even General Draven, humbled by defeat and unexpected mercy, became an unlikely ally in the difficult work of rebuilding trust between an empire and the species it had once dismissed as beneath notice. I still do not fully understand everything that happened the night I first closed my hand around that silver blade, or why a sword bonded to grief and centuries of tradition chose to wake for a chained human prisoner instead of the countless nobles who had tried and failed before me. But I understand this much clearly, carried in Vareth's steady presence at my side every single day since. It was never about where I came from, or what species I belonged to, or how much power I carried into that vast throne room in chains. It was about a single stubborn refusal, buried somewhere deep inside every person willing to keep fighting long after every reasonable voice tells them to stop. The queen once told me her husband believed hope was a discipline, chosen again and again, especially when the universe offers every reason to abandon it. I carry that discipline now, in a blade that remembers him, in a bond that chose me for reasons I am still learning to understand, and in a quiet certainty that whatever comes next, however impossible the odds may seem, I will still be standing when the sun rises. Not because I am the strongest, simply because I never learned how to stop,